Hi there. This is primarily for executives. I often get asked the question, why do we need agility? And there's all sorts of benefits, of course, adaptiveness, responsiveness, flexibility, and so on and so forth. But there's still this kind of an exam question that isn't being answered by a lot of people, which is in terms of, we managed without this before, so why do we need it now? I mean, we've managed with other ways of dealing with complexity for years, decades actually. So what do we do? So what I'd like to do this morning is just do an unofficial, unauthorized overview of Cynefin. I think Cynefin is a sense-making framework from Dave Snowden and Cognitive Edge. Really, really helps in terms of understanding why agility is so crucial and how it can actually help you to reduce risk. We might think we're increasing risk by bringing agility to our organization, but it can also help us to reduce risk, and kind of the balance tends to go in favor of actually implementing agility rather than delaying going for that. So I'm going to switch over to my flip chart. So we're going to have a look at it over there. So, all right. Just throw a little bit of light on the subject. So first of all, the pronunciation of Cynefin, it's a Welsh word, Cynefin, from cognitive-edge.com. There was a paper published in the Harvard Business Review, I think it was 2007. It was one of the most popular papers on the Harvard Business Review. I'll include the link in the footer of the video recording. And it's got 5 domains. It used to be called obvious, simple. This changed, not officially changed yet, but it's likely to change to clear, complicated, complex, chaos, and confused. But it's not quite 5 C's, because in the middle we've also got aporia. Aporia means like kind of stepping back and reflecting on what we should do next. What's the right domain to go into? So I'll explain the framework, and then we'll get into why this is relevant for you as an executive or as a senior change agent. So it's not a categorization model where you pay someone to say you're in the top right corner, you should be in the top right corner. It's more a sense-making model. So you might have a problem in a particular domain, but that doesn't mean it can't move into other domains. It's more like for sense-making rather than categorization. If we start with the clear domain, this is where you know what you know. You do it or you buy the service. Do it or buy it, I would say. This is where it's clear you don't need any experts to help you. It's obvious you can use best practice. There are some constraints about how you do that work, and essentially if it's project management, you might use project management body of knowledge. If it's IT operations, it might be IT infrastructure library. But it doesn't have to be something as fancy as a big tome book. You could have very simple things like, for example, doing a timesheet. It's fairly clear. You don't need anybody to help you. You can write an email. That's fairly clear. Although sometimes you might need to think about it. You might need to analyze how you respond. Maybe somebody has upset you or something like that, and you're trying to think about how you respond. And not even upsetting you, but it's a tricky email to answer. So you might need more time. So sometimes even writing an email might become complicated actually. But by and large, you kind of do it or buy it. If things are clear, you just go and do it. And you don't need Scrum or Kanban. You just crack on. Just do it. Scrum has loads of meetings, so why if you could just do the thing, why would you be going into empirical loops for something that's just obvious? So when something is clear, you know what you know, you just go and do it, you sense what the problem is, you categorize in terms of what tools you might use, and you respond with the appropriate tool. So a particular timesheet, particular expense sheet, and so on and so forth. The complicated domain is a bit more interesting, because in the complicated domain, this is where we know what we don't know, so we've got known unknowns. So we sense the situation, we analyze, or we get experts to bear, and then we respond. So this would be the domain of experts. So you get experts together. It might not be a good idea to use best practice as you would use down in the clear domain. You would use good practice. So there might be an equally good way that the experts you brought in know how to do this. And if you make it really strict for them, where they they can only use the one right way kind of thing. It could be frustrating. It could lead to problems. So here, where it's really about cooperation, how do we get a set of experts together to self-organize? So kind of getting from a leadership point of view, kind of get out of the way, let them kind of get together and just basically remove any obstacles in their path that are preventing them from solving the problem together. Typically, for me in real life, for me, it would be like if I was to get a plumber in the house, I don't know, I haven't a clue how to do plumbing, or I'm very bad at DIY. Or you needed some solicitor or lawyer to help you, because you need some advanced explanation of how things work. For me, cooking should be clear, but I had a story from a number of years ago where it actually ended up being very complicated. It took me 6 hours to cook a dish. And the following week, somebody brought an expert to bear, someone who really knew what she was doing, and we did it in 20 minutes. So when you're in the complicated domain, it is down to your skill level, because if you've got a very high level of skill, it'll come down into the clear. It'll be clear for you. But if you need more time to investigate, or you need experts to bear, that by essence means it's complicated. A lot of people get complicated and complex mixed up, and I used to think as well that complex just means very complicated. But what happens you kind of know you're in the complex space when, even when you get your experts together, even after doing some analysis, they can't figure out the answer. They might need to go into some kind of loop, some kind of empirical loop. Empirical means building up evidence, deciding what to do next based on what evidence you acquired. And in the complex domain, you've got unknown, so you don't know what you don't know. So you mightn't even know what product you should be building. You mightn't even know who the right customers are. Sometimes the work is on the liminal, between the border between complicated and complex. So for example, Scrum is kind of around about here on the liminal border. It isn't technically in the complex space, but in Scrum there's a thing called a product backlog, isn't there? So we already know what product we're building. And we just might need to figure out who the customers are, and which might make us a bit more deeply complex. And if you don't even know the product, it could be really, really deeply complex. So if you don't know what you don't know, you need to probe. You need to try something, sense what's going on, and then respond based on what you've learned. You also need cognitive diversity. So if you get the experts together and just relying on getting together, they could get stuck in their own little rut. And there's a fabulous video by Dave Snowden on the longitude problem, where scientists figure out how to calculate that. And even though it was very logical what he said, because it didn't tie in with what the experts were thinking at the time, it was rejected for many years. So when you've got a problem that's complex, you need people who can give you some fresh perspective. There's a great book on this, Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed. It's very well narrated by Matthew himself on Audible. You should check that out if you haven't seen it. So if you're in the complex space, essentially you need some kind of empirical loop. It could be inspect and adapt from Scrum, build, measure, learn, Lean Startup, or Lean UX, Plan, Do, Check, Act, Plan, Do, Study, Act from the 20th century. Something that helps you to learn what's going on. And in this space, it's more about large group facilitation and collaboration, because the people who might solve the problem might not necessarily know each other. So you're bringing in some fresh ideas, fresh perspective, even from other industries, other sectors, other departments, other functions, other disciplines, to help you to try and solve the problem. So there is an error in thinking that we always need the experts on a problem. That's very good thinking in the complicated space. We're in the complex space. Having the expert together is not enough and can actually cause problems. So you need other people in the room for that as well. You can also be in the chaotic domain. So in chaos, you use novel practice. You can have positive chaos, like for example, you could have, like what Google used to have, I believe, was a thing called 20% time. I don't know if they do that anymore, where you spend 20% of your week working in any product that you want, and I believe a lot of their products were discovered during that, like Gmail, AdWords, AdSense, those kind of products, I believe. You can also do hackathons. So the good thing about hackathons in 20% time is the time is limited. So a hackathon is typically 24 hours in a 3-month period. So you basically relax the rules, you relax the constraints. There's no effective constraints, and you kind of let people just crack on. They don't even have sprints. They're just working together, collaborating, and you do need this cognitive diversity here as well, to unleash new ideas. But there's a negative part of chaos, and this is why I have a kind of a thick border between clear and chaos, and so I've got an RAP sign and a kind of a cross there, kind of indicating that what can happen is we think something is clear, we think it's predictable, we get confident in how we deliver things, and we just fall over the cliff, and it's really expensive to get out of that. And so in this space, when you're in this kind of bad type of chaos, a typical strategy would be to be more like a dictator, to kind of just kind of do something. So in this space, you do something to kind of get you out of a rut. So why is this relevant for executives? Well, number one, if your problem is on the right hand side, if it is either clear or complicated, it's essentially plannable. It's ordered. You can come up with a plan. If it's on the left hand side, it is essentially unplannable, and forecasting isn't the right strategy. If you use forecasts in this space, they are fraught with risk. Dave Stone mentioned last week a term called sidecasting, which he just admittedly made up on the spot, where you kind of look at where you are, you take a sidestep, and then decide what to do next. There are some techniques you can use, for example, Monte Carlo probabilistic forecasting in this space. You can even use it over here, but you're giving lots of health warnings about actually the value of the forecast is limited, given we don't know what we don't know, and it's even lower here where it's not even possible to know what we don't know because we're dealing with unknowable unknowns. So plannable, unplannable, that's the so what number one. So what number two is, depending on what kind of problem you have, you should act differently. So instead of doing what you always did, you should think, hang on a second, this is clear, so just follow a particular practice to do that. Well, this is complicated. Which experts do we need to bring to bear? Or it's complex, so let's get everybody in the room in the hope that we get the right answer. Or it's negative chaos, in which case maybe we need to turn into kind of dictator mode. So you'll see me acting very differently depending on the domain that we're in. And so if you don't know which one of these you're in, you're basically confused. But you can be positively confused as well, because that's not a bad place to start. Actually go into the confused state and say, you know what, I actually don't know what's the right domain for this. So do I need to go here? Do I need to go here? Do I need to go here? It's actually a good starting point. But if you're not even aware of the whole thing, it could mean that you just do what you always did. For example, there's a lady that I worked with before, and what she did was every time there was a problem, she just got everybody in the room. And people thought she wasn't technical, but actually she was. The problem was that what she should have done is just got the experts together, maybe 2 or 3, not 10 to 15 people, 2 or 3, trust them to get the job done. And I've other people then, the more common problem is that people have a complex problem, but they come up with some Gantt chart with milestones and so on and treat it as predictable and clear, and it's not clear. We don't know what we don't know. And so what happens is they fall over into chaos. A lot of companies survive this because they've got loads of money, so even when they fall into chaos, they can just throw money at it. It'll take a bit longer. They think they can scale up and all that kind of stuff. We'll talk about the problems with scaling. But as such, in these pandemic crisis times, I'm not sure people can afford anymore to be throwing cash at chaos. So a better strategy is to use agility to manage complexity. It doesn't reduce complexity, it just helps you to deal with it. And it's kind of interesting, you use simplicity to deal with complexity by having recurring, whether it's sprints or whatever you want to call it, some kind of rhythmic cycle of learning to figure out what we should be doing next. There's another word on this diagram as well called aporia, or being aporetic, which means not really sure. You kind of need to step back and reflect, kind of take a helicopter view of what's going on. And if I look at COVID-19 at the moment, this is just my own personal opinion. I'm not saying that it's the correct opinion, it's just me. But I think hand washing is here. Clear domain. We all know how to wash our hands now. I think in the UK, the scientists getting together every day with the politicians and giving a report on the numbers and so on, That's the experts getting together, analysing the numbers and all that. That's in the complicated space. The people who are chasing for a vaccine, the pharmaceutical companies and so on and so forth, I think that's in the deeply complex space where they're running multiple parallel experiments. Some experiments are even opposing each other, and you have a champion for each of those experiments as well. So we're genuinely expecting some of these to lose and some of these to win. It's important when you run these experiments that they're safe to fail, so that you can afford to lose. You can afford to lose the money. You can afford, in terms of prestige as well, in terms of your career and so on. That you have a dampening strategy set up in advance, so that if this doesn't work, that you have a story for what you're going to do next or whatever. You've got some way to kind of protect yourself. But ultimately, nobody should be harmed from an experiment or a probe. So running multiple experiments together is usually a very good strategy, because I often hear from executives, well, the only failure is the lack of learning, but they're still embarrassed when they go to the board. So for that reason, I prefer multiple parallel experiments, not just one sequential set of experiments that are all depending on each other, because then there's going to be a bias towards saying the experiments are successful when maybe they're actually not so successful. So that's really, really important as well. So when you're operatic, you basically stand back and you're trying to decide which one do you go into. I think when the lockdowns happened in a lot of these countries, I think we went into chaos. We did something, just do something, and sometimes it works and it gets you back into the space. The idea is not to be in complex forever. As you're learning, then you hopefully move your work into the complicated space where it's a bit more plannable, and eventually it becomes clear. Just be warned that when your work is complex, it's essentially unplannable. So stop asking for milestone plans. There is a way to figure out when it will be done. It's risky, but it's better than using milestone plans. So key learnings: plannable, unplannable. Avoid confusion if you can. Initially, you might go into confusion about deciding in terms of the problem which area you go into. I think exit lockdown, for example, is probably an aporia where countries are stepping back and they're not really sure how to handle it, and maybe there's an element of doing something, and there's an element of just learning just to see what happens when people all come back together, or we might have to come back into aporia again to decide what do we do next. We might need to apologise to the experts and say, actually, you were right. We shouldn't have exited lockdown too early. We should just go back here again. So it's a very, very useful framework for helping you to make decisions. And I think this is really one of the first things that you should understand as an executive. When you're in the complex space, using predictable approaches is not the right approach. If you want to be in chaos, that's okay. You might thrive on it, but some leaders do. It's not a very good strategy in the long term, I would suggest. Try to get yourself in a space where you're learning, and as you learn more, you move more into the complicated space, and then things are becoming clearer for your teams. Just to go back to my screen now. So I just want to show you, I put a soft copy together of this just to summarize. So essentially, this is a soft copy, which I'll put a link to this as well on the recording. So it's kind of a neater drawing, if you like, and there's a bit of graffiti on this. I'm giving attribution, obviously, to Dave Snowden and to Cognitive Edge for their wonderful work here, but the graffiti is my understanding of how things have changed. So one of the things that I didn't mention when I was going through Complex is that there's been a kind of a change of emphasis from using emergence looping. I think that's still needed, but when you're innovating in this space, it's more likely that you're going to be exaptive. So an example with COVID-19 would be where people figured out how to use CPAP filtration masks to feed oxygen to people, to keep patients awake, to avoid them going onto ventilators. That's an example of exaptation, where you use something that was invented for something else, for obstructive sleep apnea, but they're now applying it. For a different reason. And there was another example as well in the, I think it was in Malaysia somewhere, where somebody drove his car into a plastic bag, knew there was a flood coming, and it was an industrial plastic bag. Great example of exaptation. He saved his car, and it was just using the product in a completely different way. Okay, so thank you very much, and there will be a follow-up video on this as well, where we drill more into the aporia area. Thank you.